Hello. If you want to have a good night's sleep, listen to our stories. I'm sure you'll sleep very well. Please subscribe to our channel. There are stories that begin in silence, in places where the world only sees the surface but never the truth. And in the center of a restless city, where glass towers sliced the sky and neon lights blurred the darkness, there stood one skyscraper unlike any other. It wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a symbol, a palace in the clouds for those who could afford to escape the streets below. The lobby gleamed with marble floors so polished that they reflected every chandelier hanging above. Security guards in pristine uniforms stood like statues. Residents swept in and out carrying shopping bags, designer coats draped on their shoulders, eyes fixed on phones that glittered with the glow of status. To most people walking past, the tower was an untouchable world, a dream they would never live in. And yet, the man who owned it all felt like the loneliest figure of them all. He had everything society promised would bring happiness: a fortune built on security technology, magazines that wrote about his empire, and investors who hung on his every word. But what none of them knew was that every evening, when the last meeting ended and the final glass of champagne was poured, he would sit alone in a penthouse office, staring at the skyline, wondering when the world had stopped feeling real. Wealth had given him walls of glass, transparent enough to see others, but strong enough to keep them out. He was admired, respected, envied, but never known. And deep down, he carried a quiet suspicion that if all the money disappeared tomorrow, no one would remain by his side. It was on one of those nights, with the city humming below like an endless machine, that an idea began to grow inside him. What if he could see the building he had created not from the top, but from the inside? What if he could touch the lives of the people living in his tower, not as a landlord, not as a billionaire, but as one of them? The thought was dangerous, reckless, but once it entered his mind, it refused to leave. The next morning, while the rest of the city stirred awake, he stood in front of a mirror, no longer dressed in tailored suits. Instead, he wore a faded gray shirt, work boots with scuffed leather, and a baseball cap pulled low to shadow his features. His reflection startled him. Without the armor of wealth, without the polish of status, he looked ordinary, perhaps even invisible. And that was exactly what he wanted. He slipped through the staff entrance of the tower, the door that no resident ever noticed, and walked into a world that few people like him had ever stepped into. The world of cleaners, technicians, delivery workers, the silent army that kept the luxury alive. The building manager barely looked at him when he introduced himself with a false name. There was always a shortage of hands, and nobody cared who carried a mop as long as the job got done. That first day, he pushed a cart down the endless hallways, the sound of wheels echoing against marble. Nobody greeted him. Nobody smiled politely or asked about the market. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of attention. He was background noise, part of the scenery, unnoticed and unimportant. And strangely, it felt like freedom. The work was harder than he expected. His hands, accustomed to signing contracts and tapping keyboards, fumbled with buckets and tools. His shoulders ached from carrying boxes. But there was a satisfaction in the ache. Every task finished wasn't because of his name. It was because of his effort. And that was a kind of wealth he had almost forgotten existed. Days turned into weeks. He scrubbed floors, carried deliveries, and even climbed onto the roof to replace faulty wiring. Slowly, he began to observe the tower in ways he had never done before. The luxury he had once boasted about to investors now revealed itself as fragile human stories tucked behind polished doors. He noticed the single mother in apartment 9A, who came home late every night, exhaustion written across her face as she carried grocery bags heavier than her strength. He noticed the retired violinist who played softly on his balcony every morning, notes drifting into the city like memories too fragile to keep inside. He noticed the young couple who argued in hushed tones near the elevator, smiles plastered on their faces whenever a neighbor passed by, as though pretending their love wasn't already breaking. Every floor held lives stitched together by struggle, hope, and quiet victories. They weren't numbers on rent ledgers anymore. They were human. But among all the residents he silently observed, there was one face that began to follow him even after he walked away. A woman whose presence didn't just catch his attention, it unsettled him in ways he hadn't felt in years. The first time he saw her, she was arguing with the leasing office. Her voice was steady but sharp, full of frustration she didn't bother to hide. Something about the way she stood, shoulders squared against the weight of her world, made him pause mid-step. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back in a hurry, but her eyes burned with a kind of determination that no luxury could buy. Later he overheard whispers among the staff. She was struggling to pay her rent. She worked multiple jobs, and most of all, she hated the wealthy residents who treated the building like a kingdom. In her eyes, the rich were arrogant, cold, untouchable. If only she knew how close her words cut. From that moment, his disguise wasn't just a shield. It became a lifeline. He couldn't reveal who he was, not yet, perhaps not ever, because something told him that if she discovered the truth, whatever fragile connection might grow between them would shatter before it even began. So he kept sweeping floors, tightening bolts and carrying boxes, all while stealing glances when she passed. She looked right through him, never suspecting the man behind the mask. To her, he was just another worker, another nameless figure in the background of her life. And yet, every time she walked by, he felt the fragile threads of fate tighten around them, weaving a story neither of them knew had already begun. He knew one thing: masks are easy to wear, but the longer you hide behind one, the harder it becomes to take it off. And someday soon, the truth would no longer belong to him alone. Every building, no matter how tall, holds stories that burn quietly behind its doors. Some of those stories are whispered, others are buried under silence. And then there are the ones that cannot help but blaze, the kind that leave a mark on everyone they touch. For him, the man hiding behind work boots and a mop, living a double life inside his own skyscraper, that fire took the shape of a woman who lived several floors below. He had seen her before at a distance, a figure rushing through the lobby, her hair tied back in a messy knot, her coat thrown over her arm, bags digging into her shoulders. There was nothing glamorous about her entrances or exits, nothing that screamed of wealth or privilege. She didn't float through the lobby with the effortless grace of the wealthy tenants. She pushed through it with determination, like someone who carried the weight of the world on her back and refused to let it crush her. The first time he truly noticed her, she was standing at the leasing office counter. Her voice wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough to cut through the hum of the lobby. "I've told you," she said, her tone controlled but brimming with frustration. "The payment will be in by Friday. I just need 3 more days. I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for time." The man behind the desk shifted uncomfortably, already rehearsing the polite but rigid policies he was trained to recite. The owner, though disguised as nothing more than a worker passing by with a cart of cleaning supplies, paused. He shouldn't have lingered. It wasn't his place to listen, and yet something in her voice rooted him to the marble floor. She wasn't begging. She wasn't shrinking. She stood tall, chin lifted, eyes locked onto the clerks with a kind of defiance that carried the weight of every hardship she had endured. She was proud, even in the face of struggle. He knew that stance. He knew it better than anyone. Because behind all the wealth he carried like a second skin, he too had once stood with empty hands and nothing but pride to protect him. He remembered the sting of being dismissed, of being treated like he was invisible. That memory echoed inside him as he watched her, a stranger who seemed to mirror a piece of his own past. Later, he overheard pieces of her story. The staff always talked. Whispers carried faster than elevator rides. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She taught music lessons to children on weekends. She was late with rent more often than not, but never by more than a week. And despite the cracks in her financial stability, she never once asked for pity. If anything, she carried herself like someone ready to go to war with the world if it ever tried to break her. He found himself watching for her in small, unguarded moments. Not stalking, not invading, just noticing. The way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. The sigh that escaped her lips as she pressed the elevator button late at night. The tired smile she gave to the doorman, even when she had nothing left to give. To the wealthy residents around her, she was probably invisible. To him, disguised in worn clothes and carrying tools, she was impossible to ignore. One evening, their paths finally crossed in a way that left no room for him to stay just an observer. She had dropped a bag of groceries in the lobby. Apples rolled across the polished floor, oranges spun under a bench, and a bottle nearly shattered as it slipped from her hands. Without thinking, he bent down, scooping up the runaway fruit before it disappeared under a couch. "Here," he said quietly, holding it out to her. She looked up, startled, as though she hadn't expected anyone to help. Her eyes met his, sharp, searching, but also wary. He wondered what she saw in him. Just another maintenance worker. Just another face she would forget by morning. "Thanks," she said after a pause, taking the apple from his hand. Her voice was softer now, but still carried that edge, that fire that refused to be extinguished. For him, it was a moment far larger than it seemed. For her, it was just a fleeting interaction. She gave him a polite nod and turned away, gathering the rest of her things without another word. But as she walked toward the elevator, he realized something that made his chest tighten. She didn't look at him the way the rich residents did. She didn't look through him either. She looked at him as if he were real, as if he mattered. And that was more dangerous than anything else, because he was already keeping one secret, that he wasn't the man she thought he was. And now, without even trying, she had become the reason he dreaded the day that secret would unravel. As the weeks went on, he learned more about her without ever asking. She laughed with the cleaning lady on her floor, sometimes leaving small snacks for the staff in the hallway. She always paid attention to people who usually went unseen, the very people he had decided to become. And yet, whenever the subject of the building's wealth came up in conversation, her jaw tightened, her voice sharpened, and she made her opinion clear. People like them don't care. They'll never understand what it's like to struggle. He flinched the first time he heard it, not because she was wrong, but because to her, he was one of them. Every interaction from then on became a delicate balance. He wanted to be near her, but not too near. He wanted to speak, but not too much. Each moment they shared, no matter how small, a held door, a polite nod, a quiet "thank you," became precious to him. And yet, every step closer was also a step closer to the inevitable moment when she would discover the truth. For her, he was just another worker in the tower. For him, she had already become the brightest flame in a life that had grown cold. And though he didn't dare admit it yet, not even to himself, he knew this. Fire, once touched, always leaves a mark. Connections have a way of surprising us. They rarely arrive when we plan for them, and they almost never look the way we imagine. Sometimes they sneak in quietly, like a whisper in the background. Other times, they crash into our lives like a storm we never saw coming. For him, the man who lived two lives inside the walls of his own skyscraper, it began with something so small, so ordinary, that he almost missed it. It started with an elevator. He had been repairing a flickering light on the 12th floor, his toolbox balanced against the wall when she stepped in. Her arms were full, grocery bags pulling at her wrists, keys dangling from her fingers, her phone buzzing somewhere deep in her coat pocket. She pressed the button for her floor with her elbow, muttering under her breath about a deadline she was already late for. He almost didn't step inside. He could have waited for the next one, let her ride up in peace, but something tugged at him, something that told him this was a moment he shouldn't let slip away. So he caught the doors just before they closed and stepped inside. For a few seconds, silence filled the space, just the low hum of machinery and the faint rustle of plastic bags. He stood at the corner, cap pulled low, pretending to adjust the toolbox. She shifted her weight, clearly exhausted, clearly distracted. And then the elevator jolted. It wasn't much, just a sudden shake, a pause that lasted 2 heartbeats too long. The lights flickered once, twice before stabilizing. Her eyes snapped to the ceiling, her grip tightening around the bags. "Don't tell me this thing's breaking now," she muttered. He glanced at the panel, then at her. "It's fine, just a hiccup. Happens sometimes." His voice was calm, steady. She exhaled sharply, a half laugh escaping her lips. "Figures. The rent costs more than my entire paycheck, but the elevator still gets stage fright." He bit back a smile. Her sarcasm was sharp, but it was honest. And more importantly, it was real. "You live here long?" he asked, surprising himself. He rarely initiated conversations with residents, It was too risky, too dangerous. But something about her presence disarmed him. "Couple of years," she said, shifting the bags to one hip. "Don't ask me how I afford it. Honestly, I don't know either. But I guess stubbornness is a kind of currency." That made him laugh, a soft, genuine sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. She turned to look at him then, eyebrows raised slightly as if she hadn't expected someone like him, a maintenance worker, just another invisible figure in her daily life, to understand her joke. But in that brief glance, something shifted. For the first time, she looked at him not as part of the background, but as a person. And that recognition, as small as it was, felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. The elevator doors opened and she stepped out, giving him a quick nod before disappearing down the hallway. It should have ended there, a passing moment, a fragment of connection, lost to the flow of life. But for him, it lingered. From then on, the universe seemed determined to place them in each other's path. One evening, he found her struggling with a stack of boxes at the entrance, one slipping dangerously to the side. He caught it before it tumbled, steadying the pile with ease. "Seriously?" she said, half laughing, half breathless. "What is it with you showing up every time my life's falling apart in public?" "Good timing, I guess," he said. "Or bad," she countered, though there was a smile tugging at her lips. Another time he discovered her sitting on the steps outside the building, her phone pressed to her ear, frustration written across her face as she argued with someone about overdue bills. She ended the call with a sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, startled again by his presence. "Do I look okay?" she said, but the edge in her voice softened almost immediately. "Sorry. Long day," he nodded, lowering himself onto the step beside her, though leaving enough space not to intrude. They sat in silence for a while, watching the headlights streak by in the street below. And somehow, that silence felt more comforting than words. Little by little, walls that had once seemed impenetrable began to crack. She started greeting him in the hallways, sometimes with a tired smile, sometimes with a sarcastic remark about the building's quirks. He started answering, not with rehearsed politeness, but with honesty. One night, after helping her carry a heavy bag up the stairs when the elevator was out of order, she finally asked, "So what's your story? You always just around, always helping. You don't talk much about yourself." Panic flickered in his chest. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not when she still carried so much resentment toward the world he secretly belonged to. "Not much to tell," he said, keeping his voice even. "Just working, keeping things running." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines, but then she let it go, turning the conversation to lighter things. Her childhood memories, the music she loved, the way she sometimes felt like she was running a race she hadn't signed up for. And he listened, truly listened, because every word she spoke painted her as more than just a tenant, more than just a passing face. She became someone real, someone whose fire burned so brightly it drew him closer with every moment. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. The closer they grew, the more fragile his disguise became. One wrong word, one slip, and everything would crumble. But he couldn't help it. For the first time in years, he felt alive. And perhaps, just perhaps, she felt something too. Because one evening, as they stood by the entrance after he had fixed a stubborn lock on her door, she looked at him with eyes softer than he had ever seen before. "You know," she said quietly, "for someone who's supposed to be invisible in this building, you're kind of hard to ignore." The words struck him deeper than she could ever know. Invisible. That was what he had wanted to be. That was why he had put on the mask in the first place. And yet here she was, seeing him, not as an owner, not as a worker, but as a man. And that was how the unexpected connection began. Fragile, dangerous, impossible to ignore. Every secret begins as a shield, something we hide to protect ourselves, to preserve a fragile dream that might shatter if touched by the light. But as days turn into weeks, secrets don't just hide the truth. They grow heavy, pressing against the heart, like a weight that cannot be ignored. And for him, the secret was no longer just about his disguise. It had become a wall between him and the only person who had ever made him feel seen. By now, his connection with her had become undeniable. They spoke more often, laughed at things only the two of them seemed to notice, and shared moments that stretched longer than either of them intended. She teased him for always showing up at the right time, and he joked back with a calmness that disguised the storm inside him. To anyone watching, they looked like two neighbors slowly becoming friends, but he knew better. He knew that behind every word he spoke, there was a truth he wasn't telling. Behind every smile, there was a lie he was still living. And the more time he spent with her, the harder it became to keep the mask in place. Sometimes, when she spoke of her struggles with rent, he wanted to tell her, "You don't have to worry. I could erase your debt with a single signature." But he couldn't, because if she knew who he really was, she would never accept his help. She would hate him for deceiving her. Other times when she railed against the arrogance of the wealthy, he wanted to explain that not everyone with money was blind to the world, that some, like him, longed for connection more than power. But he couldn't, because in her eyes, he was already one of them, and nothing he said would change that. And so, night after night, he carried his truth like a shadow, always close, always threatening to step into the light. The cracks began to show in subtle ways. One evening they sat together on the building's rooftop, the city sprawling endlessly beneath them. She had invited him there, saying she sometimes came up to escape the noise of her apartment, to breathe in a place where the world felt a little wider. "You ever wonder," she asked, her gaze fixed on the skyline, "what it would be like to live up there?" She pointed toward the top floors of the tower, the penthouses that stretched into the clouds. All that space, all that glass, must feel like living in another world. He swallowed hard, following her gaze. "That's my world," he thought. "That's my home." Instead, he said, "Maybe, but sometimes glass walls just keep you further from people." She turned to him, frowning slightly. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, the truth sitting dangerously close to his lips. But then he shook his head. "Nothing, just talking." She studied him for a moment longer, as though sensing something she couldn't quite name. And then, with a sigh, she looked back at the city. "You know," she said softly, "you're different from the others here. You actually listen. You don't act like you're above everything." The words pierced him. If only she knew how far above it all he actually lived. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. The building itself seemed to conspire against him, throwing challenges that risked pulling his mask away. One afternoon he was in the lobby when a wealthy investor arrived unexpectedly, someone who knew him, not as a worker but as the owner. His heart nearly stopped as the man scanned the room, eyes narrowing in recognition. But just before their gazes locked, he ducked behind a maintenance cart, pretending to fix a broken wheel until the danger passed. Another time she caught him staring at an article on his phone, an article about himself. His face was right there on the screen, smiling in a tailored suit. She leaned closer, curious, and for a terrifying second, he thought she had seen. But he quickly closed the browser, mumbling something about checking the news. And then there were the slip-ups. The way he once held a glass of wine at a building event, with the ease of someone who had attended too many galas. The way he spoke about the stock market in more detail than any maintenance worker should know. The way his eyes lingered a moment too long on the penthouse elevators, as though pulled by memory. Each time she looked at him a little differently, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as though she was piecing together a puzzle she didn't yet realize she had started. And he, for his part, began to fear the inevitable, because secrets cannot stay in the shadows forever. One night, as they walked back from a small cafe she had insisted he join her at, she asked a question that froze him mid-step. "So, what's your real story?" He forced a laugh. "What do you mean? You're not like the others here. You don't act like this job is just a job. You know things. You talk differently. And sometimes..." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sometimes you look like someone carrying a bigger secret than you want to admit." His chest tightened. For a moment he thought about telling her everything, about pulling off the mask and showing her the truth. But then he saw the memory of her words. I hate rich people. They'll never understand. And he couldn't do it. Everyone has secrets, he said finally, forcing his voice to remain steady. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess they do. The silence that followed was heavier than words. From that night on, the air between them changed. She still laughed with him, still let him carry her bags or walk her home, but there was an unspoken question hanging between them, a quiet awareness that something was hidden in the shadows. And for him, the fear grew sharper. Not of losing her before anything began, but of losing her after she finally saw him for who he truly was. Because love built on secrets may burn bright, but in the end, shadows always demand the light. Every lie is a ticking clock. Sooner or later, the hands reach midnight, and what was hidden in the dark demands to be seen in the light. For him, the secret had lived in every breath, every glance, every word he spoke to her. For weeks he had carried it like a second skin, pretending to be one thing while being something entirely different. And though his heart told him to hold on a little longer, reality was moving faster than he could control. The night the truth revealed itself did not arrive gently. It came crashing into their fragile world like a storm. It began with something small, a late delivery, a mistake with an apartment repair, and a complaint that found its way directly to the top office of the tower, his office. The one no one believed belonged to the same man walking the halls in maintenance clothes. He hadn't planned to be in the building that night, but the call of duty, the life he had worked so hard to protect, pulled him back. Meetings ran late. Papers needed signatures. The weight of responsibility was inescapable. And then she walked in. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't looking for him. She had come to the upper floors by mistake, following a confused delivery worker who couldn't find the right apartment. She turned the wrong corner, stepped through the wrong set of glass doors, and there he was. Not in the worn uniform she knew, not with the casual, humble posture of a man blending in with the staff. He stood tall, draped in a tailored suit that fit him like a second skin. Behind him stretched the vast office of the building's owner, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. His name was engraved on the plaque by the desk, on the documents scattered across polished wood. For a moment, the world froze. Her breath caught in her chest, her eyes wide, her body unable to move. And he, for the first time in their fragile story, had no mask to hide behind. Their gazes locked, and the silence between them felt like thunder. "You." Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "You're... him?" He took a step forward, instinctively reaching out as though his hands could soften the truth. "Please, let me explain." But she recoiled, shaking her head. "Explain? You've been lying to me this entire time. It wasn't like that. Wasn't like that?" Her voice rose, sharp with betrayal. "You let me stand there complaining about people like you, and you just... what? Smiled, played along. Do you know how humiliating this feels?" His chest ached. Each word cut deeper than any wound he had ever known. "I never wanted to humiliate you. I wanted to know you, the real you. And I knew that if I came to you as myself, as the owner of this tower, you would never have let me close." Her laughter was hollow, broken. "So you dressed up like a lie instead? That's supposed to make it better." He tried again, desperation cracking his carefully guarded voice. "I didn't want to be the man with money, with power. I wanted to be just a man who..." His words faltered, but he forced them out. "Who fell for you." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but her face did not soften. If anything, it tightened with hurt. "You had a choice," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You could have told me the truth. Maybe not the first day, maybe not the second, but after all this time, after everything we shared, you let me believe in something that wasn't real." He shook his head, his voice cracking. "It was real, every word, every laugh, every moment with you. That was the truest thing I've ever known." But she didn't hear him. Or perhaps she couldn't. The weight of betrayal was louder than his pleas. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, retreating toward the elevator. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And with that, she was gone. The elevator doors closed between them with a metallic finality that echoed in his chest. For the first time in his life, surrounded by the empire he had built brick by brick, he felt utterly powerless. The days that followed were hollow. He still moved through the tower, still signed papers, still attended meetings, but everything around him felt blurred, as though the world had lost its sharpness. The only thing in focus was her absence. She avoided him entirely. The girl who once shared coffees and rooftop conversations now passed him in silence, her gaze fixed on the ground. If he tried to speak, she walked away. If he sent a message, it went unanswered. And yet, he could feel her anger burning, not just against him, but against herself, for trusting him, for opening the door to something she had sworn never to allow. At night, he wandered the empty halls of the skyscraper he owned, searching for a way to undo the damage. His wealth, his power, his influence, none of it meant anything in the face of her silence. Because what she wanted wasn't money. What she wanted was truth. And truth was the one thing he had failed to give her. The breaking point came one evening when he found her struggling with a heavy box in the lobby. She refused to meet his eyes, refused even to acknowledge his presence, but he couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Please," he said softly, reaching for the box, "let me help." Her grip tightened, her jaw set. "I don't need anything from you." Not even an explanation? Her eyes flashed with anger as she finally looked at him. "You had your chance. You don't get to rewrite the story now." He stepped closer, his voice raw with desperation. "I know I ruined everything. I know I broke the trust you gave me. But I can't let this end without telling you why. Without telling you that every moment with you was the only time I've ever felt like I wasn't just the man at the top of the tower. With you, I was human. With you, I was alive." Her chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a heartbeat, she almost wavered. Almost. But then she shook her head. "You say that like it should fix everything. But it doesn't. Because the man I thought I knew, he doesn't exist." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the lobby with the weight of his empire pressing down on his shoulders. And for the first time, he wondered if owning the tallest tower in the city had only left him the loneliest man inside it. The truth was out. The secret had been unveiled. And though the world around them continued spinning, their world, the fragile, beautiful one they had built in stolen moments, lay shattered at their feet. The question now was simple, yet terrifying. Could broken trust ever be rebuilt? Or had the truth destroyed the only chance they had at love? Every story has a breaking point, but sometimes what seems like an ending is only the pause before something new begins. For weeks after the truth was revealed, silence wrapped itself around their lives like a heavy fog. She avoided him. He respected her distance, but never stopped trying to reach through the walls she had built. The building, once alive with small encounters between them, now felt colder, like a palace of glass, where every reflection showed him what he had lost. But love, when real, does not disappear simply because it is wounded. It lingers, it waits, and sometimes it fights its way back into the light when neither heart expects it. It began with an accident. One rainy evening, the tower's lobby flooded with frantic voices as the fire alarm blared. A short circuit on one of the middle floors had triggered sprinklers, confusion, and panic among residents. He was there instantly, instinctively taking control. His calm, commanding presence, the presence of a man who had built this place, broke through the chaos. And then he saw her. She stood among the crowd, clutching the handrail as water dripped from her hair, her eyes darting with uncertainty. Instinct pulled him toward her, though she tried to turn away. "This way," he said firmly, guiding people toward the safe exit. His voice carried authority, not the voice of a maintenance worker, not the disguise she had once known, but the true voice of the man behind the tower. For a brief moment, her gaze locked on his, and in her eyes he saw not just the hurt of betrayal, but also a flicker of something else, something she couldn't erase, the memory of the man who had laughed with her, listened to her, and carried her groceries when no one else bothered. By the time the alarm cleared and the danger passed, the two of them found themselves standing together in the rain outside the building. The city lights reflected in the puddles at their feet, and the storm seemed to quiet just for them. She finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the rain. "Why did you do it? Why lie to me?" His answer came without hesitation, raw and stripped of all the defenses he had once used. "Because I was afraid that if you saw me for who I really am, you would never give me a chance. I didn't want you to look at me and see money or arrogance or power. I wanted you to see me, just me." Her eyes shimmered, torn between anger and something gentler. "And what if I can't separate the two?" He stepped closer, his voice steady though his heart trembled. "Then let me prove that I am not the man you thought I was, not the mask I wore, not the name on the building, just the man who fell in love with you before he even realized it." The words hung in the air, unprotected and real. In the days that followed, something shifted. She did not forgive him instantly. Trust once broken is not so easily repaired. But she began to see him differently. Not as a liar, not as a rich man hiding in plain sight, but as someone willing to risk his pride for a chance at something real. He showed up in small ways, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with the same quiet consistency that had drawn her in from the start. He still walked beside her, still listened when she spoke, still noticed the things no one else did. And slowly, the walls she had built began to crack. One evening they returned to the rooftop where so many of their conversations had begun. The city stretched endlessly before them, the lights flickering like stars scattered across the earth. She leaned against the railing, her voice quiet. "You know, part of me still hates what you did. The lies, the disguise, the games." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I hate it too. Every day. Because it cost me your trust. And that trust is worth more than this entire tower." Her lips trembled as she turned to him. "And yet, another part of me remembers the man who was there before I knew the truth. The man who cared when no one else did. The man who felt real." His heart pounded. That man was always me. For a long moment she said nothing. The wind tugged at her hair. The hum of the city filled the silence, and the space between them pulsed with everything unspoken. Finally she whispered, "Then prove it, not with words, with time." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "For the rest of my life, if that's what it takes." What followed was not a fairy tale. It was something harder, messier, more human. There were arguments, doubts, moments when she nearly walked away again. But there were also moments of laughter, of rediscovered trust, of quiet understanding that grew stronger each day. Love did not return in a single instant. It rebuilt itself brick by brick, like the tower itself, fragile at first, but reaching higher with every effort. And slowly, she began to believe again, not in the man who owned the tower, but in the man who had chosen to step down from it just to stand beside her. Months later, they stood together on the rooftop once more, watching the sunrise paint the city in gold. She leaned against him, her voice soft. "You know, I used to think people like you and people like me lived in two different worlds." He smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "Maybe we do, but maybe love is the bridge between them." And as the sun climbed higher, casting its light across the tower that had once divided them, they both realized something simple and undeniable. The building may have been his, but their love belonged to neither glass nor steel. It belonged to them, beyond the lies, beyond the pain, beyond the tower itself.